Day 2 of World War One. Today's topic is justifications for war, and the main question is, why would you start a war to end all wars? And that's what people called it at the time. Most Europeans called it the war to end all wars. So if you thought it was the war to end all wars, why would you start that war? The only answer that makes any sense is that you thought you could win. You would only start this war if you thought you could win. So let's talk about nationalism, part 2, because that helps us to justify war. This question has 2 parts. How and why did the German nationalists prepare for war against France? Germany and France had been suspicious of each other for generations. Between 1880 and about 1910, there had been 30 years or so of peace, but everyone knew war was coming. Everyone knew there would have to be a final showdown. And German nationalists believed that they would be attacked and forced to fight on 2 fronts. Germany, in the middle, believed that they would be forced to fight France and Russia at the same time. So, German military strategists developed a theory to justify making the first strike, as in making attack a defensive maneuver. A strategist famously named Schlieffen decided that the only way to deal with the situation of being stuck with a war on 2 fronts was to attack France first, defeat quickly, and then turn and fight Russia. This plan was thought of for a couple reasons. 1, they thought it would take Russia a while to mobilize their soldiers, and 2, they thought they could attack and defeat France quickly. Defeating Russia quickly didn't seem possible to anybody at the time. Everyone knew what had happened to Napoleon. Everyone knew that the Russians could simply retreat endlessly. And so attacking France made sense as like a tidy task to do first, and then turn and attack Russia. This only works if France can be defeated quickly, because if Germany is busy occupied with France while Russia attacks, you have the same problem you did before. So this relies on a quick defeat of France, and that requires on the element of surprise. That also requires Germany violating the neutrality of Belgium. The plan was for Germans to go through neutral Belgium and to sneak into France, loop around, and catch the French on the backside while the French were facing the German border, preparing for an invasion there. This whole plan only works if the French don't have time to relocate their forces. It also only works if Belgium is defeated quickly or they surrender. Schlieffen, the expert who came up with this plan in around 1905, planned on the well-known opportunism and, say, avarice of King Leopold of Belgium. Everyone knew of Leopold's exploits in Congo, although no one was willing to talk about them. And the German military assumed that Leopold would be open to a negotiated agreement. Germany offered Leopold a chunk of France in exchange for a walk through his country. They offered to bribe him, offered to pay him a £2 million sterling cash reward. None of this went through the Belgian government, and none of this actually came to fruition because, as it turns out, Leopold died before any of this actually took place. But the plan to invade through Belgium stayed in place regardless. The German plan, as you can see in the central picture, has 2 parts: swoop through Belgium quickly, conquer Paris, and hit the French forces on the backside, then loop back through Germany and attack Russia, thereby defeating France, and then moving on to Russia. This plan requires the element of surprise, a good amount of stealth, and also the German military had new uniforms in this new color, field gray, as it's called. It's sort of a greenish gray color, the closest thing that any of the military powers had to camouflage at the start of the war. The German military developed this after their experiences fighting the Herero in Southwest Africa. It's sort of proto-camouflage without the print, but it's a pretty good color to choose if you wanted to blend in with both forests, fields, and mountains. This brings us to the French side. How and why did French nationalists prepare for war against Germany? So the French military planners also expected and knew there would be a war against Germany at some point. They fully expected a German invasion, and so they spent a generation building forts along the border between France and Germany to sort of funnel German troops into a narrow corridor. You can see on the upper right picture, this is their old plan, defense. And the blue lines represent French forts with an opening in between. And the idea was that the German troops would funnel through there and the French could fight them in smaller numbers. However, uh, advanced knowledge of the German plan to swoop through Belgium and rake across Paris came to the French planners, and they decided to change their old plan. Instead of just defense, they would also go on the offense. They would attack. However, rather than attacking at Belgium, where their allies were, they would simply cut straight across the border the minute the Germans violated Belgian neutrality and head straight for Berlin. Part of the reasoning was a new belief in the French élan vital, which is their vital forcefulness of spirit and victory and spirit of bravery. And this was supposed to be the French secret weapon. It was supposed to be the secret weapon that France had had in the age of Napoleon, the thing that made the French French, the thing that gave them the power of the revolution, that gave them the ability to conquer Europe with Napoleon. This is the spirit of life. Their commitment to these bright red pants and blue jacket and red hat uniforms just gives evidence to their commitment to the spirit of élan and the spirit of bravery. The French strategy was not to hide, not to defend, not to use camouflage, but to attack on open ground in sort of a human wave. They almost want the enemy to see them coming and be scared. Question number 3. Why did Russia support Serbian nationalists? And number 2, why did Russia support France? So it's another 2-part question, but it's about 2 different places. Mostly the focus here is Russia. So Russia and Serbia, as you can see by the map on the upper right, it's not labeled, but the different colors represent language groupings. You can see the French, the Spanish, and the Italians are all sort of bluish. And you can see that Russia and Polish and Czech and then Serbo-Croatian and Ukrainian, all those, they're sort of in the greenish family. So all these greenish languages are part of the Slavic language families. Russia and Serbia are both Slavic nations, and many other nationalities in Europe are also part of this language group. And you want to think of it kind of like in the Americas, Latinx cultures in the Americas. There's quite a bit of crossover from culture to culture because of the shared language. They share music and traditions and stories, and these days, television shows and movies. But back then, because they shared language, they shared religion and culture and traditions and clothing and more trade and things like that as well. This meant that the nation of Russia felt a good amount of sympathy for the nation of Serbia. They had shared culture, they had elements of shared lifestyle, shared religion, and shared language. When Serbia found itself bullied by the Empire of Austria Hungary, Russia felt like they needed to support their fellow Slavic people. Russian support for France, on the other hand, is a little bit less obvious, but a little bit more straightforward. Russia and France became allies because they both hated Germany. They both hated Germany and they both feared Germany. They both suspected Germany. So it's a little more straightforward, but it's kind of a less sympathetic reason. So this is our last question. How did the war start? All right, so why did a Serbian nationalist killing an Austrian prince in Bosnia start a war? So, at first, this sounds crazy, but nationalism leads nations to take credit for the achievement of individuals. And on the flip side, it leads them to blame entire nationalities for the actions of a single member. So, for example, Gavrilo Princip, the man in the mugshot towards the middle of the screen, was a Serbian nationalist, and he did not appreciate Austria Hungary's treatment of Serbians in its empire. A fair number of Serbians and other Slavs lived in places like Bosnia. And in order to make his point, in order to make Princip's point about Austria's unfair treatment of Slavic peoples, he traveled to Bosnia at the same time that the crown prince or the archduke named Ferdinand was scheduled to be there for an official visit. Gavrilo Princip, through a lot of interesting circumstances, uh, found himself in a position to assassinate Ferdinand. Princip shot him point blank. Uh, Ferdinand was in a car, a convertible. His wife was killed also. And it was a big tragedy, an international tragedy when anybody gets assassinated. Princip was quickly arrested. You can see here in the photo on the far right, um, the Archduke's uniform pretty bloodied. He died very quickly. And super quickly, the empire of Austria Hungary blamed the entire nation of Serbia for Princip's actions. And the empire of Austria Hungary and its emperor um, pretty much started war with the nation of Serbia over this incident. The entire nation of Serbia was held responsible for the actions of Princip, and Princip was assassinating one individual, Ferdinand, as representative of his nation, Austria Hungary. So these two men and their one interaction led to starting a war between two entire nations. And you know probably the rest of the story. Russia will support Serbia, France will support Russia, and the war will start. These are the four summaries for today. How and why did German nationalists prepare for war? How and why did French nationalists prepare for war? Why did Russia support the countries it supported? Why did Russia support Serbia? And why did Russia support France? And then lastly, why did a Serbian killing an Austrian in Bosnia start a war between everybody in the entire world? Your historical evidence interpretation question for tonight is, what were the justifications, the reasons for starting a war?